how you doing today? I hope you're doing great, but in case you aren't, don't worry about that because you've just reached Dreamland. It's opening just for you. Let's enter it together and hide in today's story. Are you ready? Let's get comfortable. Pat the pillows because the dream ride is about to begin. James Joyce, Dubliners, A Little Cloud. 8 years before he had seen his friend off at the North Wall and wished him Godspeed, Gallagher had got on. You could tell that at once by his travelled air, his well-cut tweed and fearless accent. Few fellows had talents like his, and Fever still could remain unspoiled by such success. Gallagher's heart was in the right place, and he had deserved to win. It was something to have a friend like that. Little Chandler's thoughts ever since lunchtime had been of his meeting with Gallagher, of Gallagher's invitation, and of the great city London where Gallagher lived. He was called Little Chandler because, though he was but slightly under the average stature, he gave one the idea of being a little man. His hands were wide and small, his frame was fragile, his voice was quiet, and his manners were refined. He took the greatest care of his fair silken hair and moustache and used perfume discreetly on his handkerchief. The half-moons of his nails were perfect, and when he smiled, you got a glimpse of a row of childish white teeth. As he sat at his desk in the King's Inns, he thought what changes those 8 years had brought. The friend whom had known under shabby and necessary disguise had become a brilliant figure of the London press. He turned often from his tiresome writing to gaze out of the office window. The glow of a late autumn sunset covered the grass plots and walks. It cast a shower of kindly golden dust on the untidy nurses, and the creeped old man who was drowsed on the benches flickered upon all the moving figures, on the children who ran screaming along the gravel paths, and on everyone who passed through the gardens. He watched the scene and thought of life, and, as always happened when he thought of life, he became sad. A gentle melancholy took possession of him. He felt how useless it was to struggle against fortune, this being the burden of wisdom which the ages had bequeathed to him. He remembered the books of poetry upon his shelves at home. He had bought them in his bachelor days, and many an evening, as he sat in the little room of the hall, he had been tempted to take one down from the bookshelf and read out something to his wife. But shyness had always held him back, and so the books had remained on their shelves. At times he repeated lines to himself, and this consoled him. When his hour had struck, he stood up and took leave of his desk and of his fellow clerks spontaneously. He emerged from under the feudal arch of the King's Inns, a neat, modest figure, and walked swiftly down Henrietta Street. The golden sunset was waning, and the air had grown sharp. A horde of grimy children populated the street. They stood or ran in the roadway, or crawled up the steps before the gaping doors, or squatted like mice upon the thresholds. Little Chandler gave them no thought. He picked his way deftly through all that minute vermin-like life, and under the shadow of the calm spectral mansions in which the old nobility of Dublin had roistered. No memory of the past stirred him, for his mind was full of a present joy. He had never been in Carlos's, But he knew the value of the name. He knew that people went there after the theatre to eat oysters and drink liquors, and he had heard that the waiters there spoke French and German. Walking swiftly by at night, he had seen cabs drawn up before the door and richly dressed ladies, escorted by cavaliers, alight and enter quickly. They wore noisy dresses and many wraps. Their faces were powdered, and they caught up their dresses when they touched earth, like alarm Atlantis. He had always passed without turning his head to look. It was his habit to walk swiftly in the street even by day, and whenever he found himself in the city late at night, he hurried on his way apprehensively and excitedly. Sometimes, however, he courted the causes of his fear. He chose the darkest and narrowest streets, and as he walked boldly forward, the silence that was spread about his footsteps troubled him. And at the time, a sound of low, fugitive laughter made him tremble like a leaf. He turned to the right towards Cable Street. Ignatius Galar on the London press. Who would have thought it possible 8 years before? Still, now that he reviewed the past, little Chandler could remember many signs of future greatness in his friend. People used to say that Ignatius Galar was wild. Of course, he did mix with a rakish set of fellows at the time, drank freely and borrowed money on all sides. In the end, he had got mixed up in some shady affair, some money transaction. At least that was one version of his fight. But nobody denied him talent. There was always a certain something in Ignatius Galar that impressed you in spite of yourself. Even when he was out at elbows and at his wits and for money, he kept up a bold face. Little Chandler remembered, and the remembrance brought a slight flush of pride to his cheek. One of Ignatius Galar's sayings when he was in a tight corner, "Half time now, boys," he used to say light-heartedly, "Where's my considering cap?" That was Ignatius Galar all out, and damn it, you couldn't but admire him for it. Little Chandler quickened his pace. For the first time in his life, he felt himself superior to the people he passed. For the first time, his soul revolted against the dull intelligence of Cable Street. There was no doubt about it. If you wanted to succeed, you had to go away. You could do nothing in Dublin. As he crossed Graden Bridge, he looked down the river towards the lower quays and pitied the poor stunted houses. They seemed to him a band of tramps huddled together along the river banks, their old coats covered with dust and soot, stupefied by the panorama of sunset and waiting for the first chill of night to bid them arise, shake themselves, and be gone. He wondered whether he could write a poem to express his idea. Perhaps Galar might be able to get it into some London paper for him. Could he write something original? He was not sure what idea he wished to express, but the thought that the poetic moment had touched him took life within him like an infant hope. He stepped onward bravely. Every step brought him nearer to London, farther from his own sober, inartistic life. A light began to tremble on the horizon of his mind. He was not so old, 32. His temperament might be said to be just at the point of maturity. There were so many different moods and impressions that he wished to express in verse. He felt them within him. He tried to weigh his soul to see if it was a poet's soul. Melancholy was the dominant note of his temperament, he thought, but it was a melancholy tempered by recurrences of fate and resignation and simple joy. If he could give expression to it in a book of poems, perhaps one would listen. He would never be popular. He saw that. He could not sway the crowd, but they might appeal to a little circle of kindred minds. The English critics, perhaps, would recognize him as one of the Celtic school by reason of the melancholy tone of his poems. Besides that, he would put in allusions. He began to invent sentences and phrases from the notice which his book would get. Mr. Chandler has the gift of easy and graceful verse. A wistful sadness pervades these poems. The Celtic note. It was a pity his name was not more Irish-looking. Perhaps it would be better to insert his mother's name before the surname. Thomas Malone Chandler, or better still, T. Malone Chandler. He would speak to Galar about it. He pursued his reveries so ardently that he passed his street and had to turn back. As he came near Carlos's, his former agitation began to overmaster him, and he halted before the door in indecision. Finally, he opened the door and entered. The light and the noise of the bar held him at the doorway for a few moments. He looked about him, but his sight was confused by the shining of many red and green wine glasses. The bar seemed to him to be full of people, and he felt that the people were observing him curiously. He glanced quickly to right and left, throwing slightly to make his errand appear serious. But when his sight cleared a little, he saw that nobody had turned to look at him. And there, sure enough, was Ignatius Gallagher leaning with his back against the counter and his feet planted far apart. "Oh, hello, Tommy, old hero, here you are. What is it to be? What will you have? I'm taking whiskey. Better stuff than we got across the water. Soda? Lithia? No mineral? I'm the same. Spoils the flavor. Oh, here, garçon. Bring us 2 halves of malt whiskey like a good fellow. Well, how have you been pulling along since I saw you last? Oh, dear God. How old we are getting. Do you see any signs of aging in me? Oh, what? A little gray and thin on top. What? Ignatius Gallagher took off his hat and displayed a large, closely cropped hat. His face was heavy, pale, and clean-shaven. His eyes, which were of bluish slate color, relieved his unhealthy pallor and shone out plainly above the vivid orange tie he wore. Between these rival features, the lips appeared very long and shapeless and colorless. He bent his hat and felt with 2 sympathetic fingers the thin hair at the crown. Little Chandler shook his head as a denial. Ignatius Gallagher put on his hat again. "It pulls you down," he said. "Press life. Always hurry and scurry, looking for copy and sometimes not finding it, and then always to have something new in your stuff. Damn proofs and printers, I say, for a few days. I'm just glad I can tell you to get back to the old country. Does the fellow get a bit of a holiday? I feel a ton better since I landed again in dear, dirty Dublin. Here you are, Tommy. Water? Say when?" Little Chandler allowed his whiskey to be very much diluted. "You don't know what's good for you, my boy," said Ignatius Gallagher. "I drink mine neat." "I think I'll take my whiskey. I drink very little as a rule," said Little Chandler modestly. "An odd half one or so when I meet any of the old crowd, that's all." "Oh, well," said Ignatius Gallagher cheerfully. "Here's to us and to old times and all acquaintance." They clinked glasses and drank the toast. "I'm met some of the old gang today, said Ignatius Galar. O'Hara seems to be in a bad way. What's he doing? Nothing, said Lily Chandler. He's gone to the docks. But Hogan has a good sit, hasn't he? Yes, he's in the Land Commission. I met him one night in London and he seemed to be very flush. Poor O'Hara. Booze, I suppose. Other things too, said Lily Chandler shortly. Ignatius Gallaher laughed. Tommy, he said, I see you haven't changed an atom. You're the very same serious person that used to lecture me on Sunday mornings when I had a sore head and a fore on my tongue. You'd want to knock about a bit in the world. Have you never been anywhere even for a trip? I've been to the Isle of Man, said Lily Chandler. Ignatius Gallaher laughed. The Isle of Man, he said. Go to London or Paris. Paris for choice. That would do you good. Have you seen Paris? I should think I have. I've knocked about there a little. And is it really so beautiful as they say? Asked Lily Chandler. He sipped a little of his drink while Ignatius Gallaher finished his boldly. Beautiful? Said Ignatius Gallaher, pausing on the word and on the flavor of his drink. It's not so beautiful, you know. Of course, it is beautiful. But it's the life of Paris that's the thing. And there's no city like Paris for gaiety, movement, excitement. Little Chandler finished his whiskey and, after some trouble, succeeded in catching the barman's eye. He ordered the same again. I've been to the Moulin Rouge, Ignatius Gallaher continued when the barman has removed their glasses. And I've been to all the Bohemians' cafes. Hot stuff. Not for a pious chap like you, Tommy. Little Chandler said nothing until the barman returned with 2 glasses. Then he touched his friend's glass lightly and reciprocated the former toast. He was beginning to feel somewhat disillusioned. Gallaher's accent and way of expressing himself did not please him. There was something vulgar in his friend which he had not observed before, but perhaps it was only the result of living in London amid the bustle and competition of the press. The old personal charm was still there under this new gaudy manner, and after all, Gallaher had lived. He had seen the world. Little Chandler looked at his friend enviously. Everything in Paris is gay, said Ignatius Gallaher. They believe in enjoying life, and don't you think they're right? If you want to enjoy yourself properly, you must go to Paris. And mind you, they have a great feeling for the Irish there. When they heard I was from Ireland, they were ready to eat me, man. Little Chandler took 4 or 5 sips from his glass. Tell me, he said, is it true that Paris is so immoral, as they say? Ignatius Gallaher made a cuddly gesture with his right arm. Every place is immoral, he said. Of course you do find spicy bits in Paris. Go to one of the student balls, for instance. That's lively if you like when the cockhots begin to let themselves loose. You know what they are, I suppose. I've heard of them, said Little Chandler. Ignatius Gallaher drank off his whiskey and shook his head. He said, you may say what you like. There's no women like the Parisian for style, for go. Then it is an immoral city, said Little Chandler with timid instinct. I mean, compare with London or Dublin. London, said Ignatius Gallaher. It's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. You ask Hogan, my boy. I showed him a bit about London when he was over there. He'd open your eye. I say, Tommy, don't make punch of that whiskey. Liquor up. No, really.
Oh, come on. Another one won't do you any harm. What is it? The same again, I suppose? Well, all right. Francois, the same again. Will you smoke, Tommy? Ignatius Galar produced his cigar case. The two friends lit their cigars and puffed at them in silence until the drinks were served. I'll tell you my opinion, said Ignatius Gallaher, emerging after some time from the clouds of smoke in which he had taken refuge. It's a rum world. Talk of immorality. I've heard of cases. What am I saying? I've known them. Cases of immorality. Ignatius Gallaher puffed thoughtfully at his cigar, and then, in a calm historian's tone, he proceeded to sketch for his friend some pictures of the corruption which was rife abroad. He summarized the vices of many capitals and seemed inclined to award the palm to Berlin. Some things he could not vouch for, his friends had told to him, but of the others he had had personal experience. He spared neither rank nor caste. He revealed many of the secrets of religious houses on the continent and described some of the practices which were fashionable in high society, and ended by telling with details a story about an English duchess, a story which he knew to be true. Little Chandler was astonished. "Oh, well," said Ignatius Gallaher. "Here we are in old jug along Dublin where nothing is known of such things." "How dull you must find it," said Little Chandler, "after all the other places you've seen." "Well," said Ignatius Gallaher, "it's relaxation to come over here, And after all, it's the old country, and they say, isn't it? You can't help having a certain feeling for it. That's a human nature. But tell me something about yourself. Hogan told me you had tested the choice of connubial bliss 2 years ago, wasn't it?" Little Chandler blushed and smiled. "Yes," he said. "I was married last May, 12 months. "I hope it's not too late in the day to offer my best wishes," said Ignatius Gallaher. "I didn't know your address, or I'd have done so at the time." He extended his hand, which Little Chandler took. "Well, Tommy," he said, "I wish you and yours every joy in life. All tab and tons of money, and may you never die till I shoot you." And that's the wish of a sincere friend, an old friend. You know that? "I know that," said Little Chandler. "Any youngsters?" said Ignatius Gallaher. Little Chandler blushed again. "We have one child," he said. "Son or daughter?" "A little boy." Ignatius Gallaher slapped his friend sonorously on the back. "Bravo," he said. "I wouldn't dub you, Tommy." Little Chandler smiled, looked confusedly at his glass, and bit his lower lip with 3 childishly white front teeth. "I hope you'll spend an evening with us," he said. "Before you go back, my wife will be delighted to meet you. We can have a little music and—" "Thanks awfully, old chap," said Ignatius Gallaher. I'm sorry we didn't meet earlier, but I must leave tomorrow night." "Oh, tonight perhaps?" "I'm awfully sorry, old man. You see, I'm over here with another fellow, clever young chap he is too, and we arranged to go to a little card party. Only for that—"
"Oh, in that case.
"But who knows," said Ignatius Gallaher considerately. "Next year I may take a little skip over here. Now that I've broken the ice, it's only a pleasure deferred."
"Very well," said the Little Chandler. "The next time you come we must have an evening together. That's agreed now, isn't it?"
"Yes, that's agreed," said Ignatius Gallaher. "Next year, if I come, parole d'honneur."
"And to clinch the bargain," said Little Chandler, "we'll just have one more now." Ignatius Gallaher took out a large gold watch and looked at it. "Is it to be the last?" he said. "Because, I have an AP." "Oh, yes, positively," said Little Chandler.
"Very well, then," said Ignatius Gallaher. "Let us have another one as Adieu Andoury." That's good vermicelli for a small whiskey, I believe. Little Chandler ordered the drinks. The blush which had risen to his face a few moments before was establishing itself. A trifle made him blush at any time, and now he felt warm and excited. 3 small whiskies had gone to his head, and Galaria's strong cigar had confused his mind, for he was a delicate and abstinent person. The adventure of meeting Galaher after 80 years, of finding himself with Galaher and Corliss surrounded by lights and noise, of listening to Galaher's stories and of sharing for a brief space Galaher's burger and triumphant life, upset the equipoise of his sensitive nature. He felt actually the contrast between his own life and his friends, and it seemed to him just Gallagher was inferior in birth and education. He was sure that he could do something better than his friend and ever done or could ever do something higher than we're told journalism if he only got a chance. What was in that stood in his way? His unfortunate timidity. He wished to vindicate himself in some way, to assert his manhood. He saw behind Galar's refusal of his invitation. Galar was only patronizing him by his friendliness, just as he was patronizing Ireland by his visit. The barman brought their drinks. Little Chandler pushed one glass towards his friend and took up the other boldly. "Who knows," he said as they lifted their glasses. "When you come next year, I may have the pleasure of wishing long life and happiness to Mr. and Mrs. Ignatius Galar." Ignatius Galar, in the act of drinking, closed one eye expressively over the rim of his glass. When he had drunk, he smacked his lips decisively, set down his glass, and said, "No blooming fear on that, my boy. I'm going to have my fling first and see a bit of life and the world before I put my head in the sack, if I ever do." "Someday you will," said Little Chandler calmly. Ignatius Galar turned his orange tie and slate blue eyes full upon his friend. "You think so?" he said. "You'll put your head in the sack," repeated the Chandler stoutly, "like everyone else if you can find the girl." He had slightly emphasized his tone, and he was aware that he had betrayed himself, but though the color had heightened in his cheek, he did not flinch from his friend's gaze. Ignatius Galar watched him for a few moments and then said, "If I ever add occurs, you may bet your bottom dollar there'll be no mooning and spooning about it. I mean, to marry Mooney, she'll have a good fat account at the bank, or she won't do for me." Little Chandler shook his head. "Why, man alive," said Ignatius Galar vehemently, "do you know what it is? I've only to say the word, and tomorrow I can have the women and the cash. You don't believe it? Well, I know it. There are hundreds. What am I saying? Thousands of rich Germans and Jews rotten with money that only be too glad. You wait a while, my boy. See if I don't play my cards properly. When I go about the thing I mean business, I tell you, you just wait." He tossed his glass to his mouth, finished his drink, and laughed loudly. Then he looked thoughtfully before him and said in a calm tone, "But I'm in no hurry. They can wait. I don't fancy tying myself up to women, you know." He imitated with his mouth the act of tasting and made a wry face. "Must get a bit stale, I should think," he said. Little Chandler sat in the room of the hall, holding a child in his arms. To save money, they kept no servant, but Annie's young sister Monica came here for an hour or so in the morning and hour or so in the evening to help. But Monica had gone home long ago. It was 9:15. Little Chandler had come home late for tea, and
Moreover, he had forgotten to bring Annie home the parcel of coffee from Billy's. Of course, she was in a bad humor and gave him short answer coldly. Certainly they were pretty and the face itself was pretty, but he found something mean in it. Why was it so unconscious and ladylike? The composure of the eyes irritated him. They repelled him and defied him. There was no passion in them, no rapture. He thought of what Gallagher had said about rich Joyces. Those dark oriental eyes, he thought, how full they are of passion, of voluptuous longing. Why had he married the eyes in the photograph? He caught himself up and questioned and glanced nervously around the room. He found something mean in the pretty furniture which he had bought for his house on the hire system. Annie had chosen it herself, and it reminded him of her. It too was prim and pretty. A dull resentment against his life awoke within him. Could he not escape from his little house? Was it too late for him to try to live bravely like Gallagher? Could he go to London? There was the furniture still to be paid for. If he could only write a book and get it published, it might open the way for him. A volume of Byron's poems lay before him on the table. He opened it cautiously with his left hand lest he should waken the child, and began to read the first poem in the book. Hushed are the winds and still the evening gloom. Not even a zephyr wanders through the grove, whilst I return to view my Margaret's tomb and scatter flowers on the dust I love. Could he, too, write like that? Express the melancholy of his soul in verse? There were so many things he wanted to describe. His sensation of a few hours before on Braddon Bridge, for example. If he could get back again into that mood. The child awoke and began to cry. He turned from the page and tried to hush it, but it would not be hushed. He began to rock it to and fro in his arms, but its wailing cry grew keener. He rocked it faster, while his eyes began to read the second stanza. Within this narrow cell reclines her clay, that clay where once it was useless. He couldn't read, he couldn't do anything. The wailing of the child pierced the drum of his ear. It was useless. Useless. He was a prisoner for life. His arms trembled with anger, and suddenly bending to the child's face, he shouted, "Stop!" The child stopped for an instant, had a spasm of fright, and began to scream. He jumped up from his chair and walked hastily up and down the room with the child in his arms. It began to sob piteously, losing its breath for 4 or 5 seconds, and then bursting out anew. The thin walls of the room echoed the sound. He tried to soothe it, but it sobbed more convulsively. He looked at the contracted and quivering face of the child and began to be alarmed. He counted 7 sobs without a break between them and caught the child to his breast in fright. If it died! The door was burst open and a young woman ran in panting. "What is it? What is it?" she cried. "Oh, it's nothing, Annie. It's nothing." He began to cry. She flung her parcels on the floor and snatched the child from him. "What have you done to him?" she cried, glaring into his face. Little Chandler sustained for one moment the gaze of her eyes, and his heart closed together as he met the hatred in them. He began to stammer, It's nothing." He began to cry. I couldn't. I didn't do anything. What? Giving no heed to him, she began to walk up and down the room, clasping the child tightly in her arms and murmuring, "Little man, my little Penny, what's your frightened laugh? There's no love. There's no love of Mama's little lamb of the world. There's no." Little Chandler felt his cheeks suffused with shame, and he stood back out of the lamplight. He listened while the paroxysm of the child's sobbing grew less and less, and tears of remorse started to his eyes. So yes, that's it. That was James Joyce's novel from the book Dubliners. And this book is actually full of kind of portraits of people who used to live in Dublin. We could tell that it's a portrait of Dublin at all. So if you like that, I can only recommend to read the others. So yes, that was it, and have a good night or the rest of the day. Bye.